when you're writing this book, don't just give tips about things or don't just keep it on the surface. You really do have to bare your soul in order to connect with people. And it is our personal journey that connects.
Do you feel you've lost direction in life? Feel overwhelmed? Longing to reconnect with spiritual meaning and your life purpose? Then today's guest, JF Penn, may spark some answers in you. JF Penn is the award-nominated New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of 20 thrillers, dark fantasy and crime novels, as well as short stories. Her latest book is a midlife travel memoir, Pilgrimage, Lessons Learned from Solo Walking 3 Ancient Ways. Now, Joanna, there's a lot more I wanted to say about you. Many of us know you as, from the Creative Penn podcast and from the Arcane Thriller books. And so it's a new direction for you in some ways, although I believe you've always loved travel and you have a degree from Oxford University on theology. Hello and welcome to the Write the Book Inside You podcast. Tips, tools, and interviews for coaches and healers like you who want to write a non-fiction book to boost your visibility, clients, and cash flow while making a difference. I'm your host, Carol Westmore, a multi-published author and energy psychology tapping book coach. Now let's jump into today's episode.
I've always had a love of architecture and history and culture, European culture, and the religious history behind a lot of great European cities is fascinating. And so when I started walking pilgrimages, before I had the idea really for the book, I always notice things that are historical, that sort of resonate with story over 1,000 or more years. So that's kind of what goes into my fiction. But in this book, it was definitely a challenge. I didn't know what kind of book I was writing. And I know many of people in your audience, there's a kind of top-down approach where you're like, I'm going to write a book on this, which, for example, my How to Write Nonfiction is one of those. It's like, oh, here's the topic, here are the things. And I know you have many of these books. But this book, Pilgrimage, it's my only memoir as yet. I don't know if I'll ever write another one, but it's that kind of bottom-up energy that sort of says there are all these things I want to talk about and I really don't know what this book is, but if I start writing it, I think it was nearly 100,000 words that did not go into that book, because I started so many different books over the last 5 to 10 years. I've been writing bits and bobs on what I thought would be a travel book. And it brought to mind Michael Crichton's book, Travels. Do you know that one?
Yes.
Yeah. So that book, I read that, must have been back in the 90s or something, before he died. And
yes.
Yeah, and I was like, I want to write a book like that. And it's actually a book of essays about different travels. And when I started my books and travel podcast to almost work towards a book like that, and I have done solo episodes that I thought would go in. I mean, you're South African and I lived in Malawi, so I had some thoughts about Malawi and had other thoughts, and I thought that's what the book would be. But over time, it just developed into something else. And I think that would be a tip for people listening is, look, sometimes you know what the book is and you can just write it. Sometimes you do not know what the book is and it kind of emerges over time. And I think similar to pilgrimage being a sort of calling, I feel like memoir perhaps is a bit of a calling. And also sometimes these books of our heart almost just emerge over time, and we have to listen to that and respect it and not try and force it into a box that we want it to go in. I really tried to force a travel book out earlier and it just didn't happen.
I love that. One of the reasons I was inspired, it was actually at the beginning of lockdown, to help other people write the book inside them, was a combination of helping my husband write his memoirs of being a true expat in the oil and gas industry and showing me all these sheets of paper. And I said, why don't we put it into a book? And so I also wanted to help healers because of my own journey through the healing energy and coaching arenas, to help those people write their books and spread the word. But it had to be, and what I love about this podcast is meeting people who had a book inside them. that they had to write or that they really wanted to write, even beyond it being a calling card for their business. Sometimes it's both. As you say, yours emerged from, I would say, the book deep inside you.
Sure. Yeah. And it doesn't fit into my business or my fiction life. It's a completely kind of standalone thing. And I would say that to people sometimes, but you mentioned like my architectural themes, my theological interest. Even the books that don't seem to fit into your business may still have an element of you in that people connect with, that helps you reach people in a different way. It kind of gives you a different aspect to, dare I say it, your brand is like,
Yes.
I think perhaps with this book, I was quite shocked in a way, but a lot of people were like, how are you writing this book? Because that doesn't seem like something you would do. And I'm like, well, actually, it's very like me. It's just perhaps a side of me that I haven't shown before. But that is hard. And I would say to people listening as well, there are so many books in the world. And yeah, we have to write ours. But the thing that makes it your book is your most personal stuff, your most personal stories. And I think this was a real challenge with the memoir. I have written a lot of personal things in my nonfiction, and my fiction is a lot of my thoughts about the world in the voice of my characters. But this one, there was a lot of sort of personal stuff about midlife challenges and depression and all of these things. And it was tough to put it out there. But I think the only reason that our books really resonate with people is if they are personal. So I'd urge people listening, when you're writing this book, don't just give tips about things or don't just keep it on the surface. You really do have to bare your soul in order to connect with people. And it is our personal journey that connects.
Dare I bring up the topic, but with GTP on the horizon, books are nothing without that personal, personal heart.
For sure.
You could write ChatGTP can write a whole book on pilgrimage, but it's not what you, Jo, have brought to it. Get into the personal, which, as we know, does resonate with people. And I predict that your brand will explode because people say, I understand. I want to read now her arcane thrillers, which I've never read, which may interest me because of what she's written in Pilgrimage. So I think it's just worth doing. And, the other thing, when you look back 10 years from now, all those journals and pictures, you've got it in a book, you've got something. And that's what I found. I wrote my first book 10 years ago about my journey into EFT tapping from being a journalist. And there are things I wrote there and the people I helped, which have gone, but they're in the book. I can go back and look. And I mean, you still got many years ahead of you on that. But I think that's another thing and same for my husband, just putting it into a book from your heart, getting it properly published. And in your case, you did the Kickstarter. So I'm going to jump to that before we even go into the book, because it kind of could have been like a marketing aspect that people might want to hear about. First of all, you were leading up to this book by your different over the journeys you took. Am I right? And you were podcasting about it without thinking this will help the book. But ultimately, do you agree it must have? It piqued people's interest.
Well, I think I've been sharing my journey online since 2008. So I have been sharing pictures like on Instagram from my walks. But I thought I did the first pilgrimage from London to Canterbury in 2020, October 2020. And so I shared those pictures on my Instagram, but I didn't know what I thought I would write a book, but I didn't really know what it would turn into. So again, it's a case of just keep sharing your journey. And then eventually, if it does turn into a book, you will have some good photos and you'll have some good fodder to use in the marketing. So it was really sort of 2.5 years of doing the different walks and then writing something and doing the solo podcasting and all of that kind of thing. But one of the reasons I did the Kickstarter was because this is a standalone pilgrimage memoir that doesn't fit under either of my author brands. So I thought, well, in order to make this something that people might actually buy, I'm going to do a Kickstarter. And the benefit of it is also that you can get some money up front to order beautiful books and pay for beautiful books. And I wanted to do as behind my head here, the special edition hardback with color photos and silver foil and all these special things that I've never done before in a book. So I thought, well, even if, let's say, I think my goal was like £1,000 or something, if I can make that much, then I will be able to do these special books. In the end, it made over £26,000. So that was really good. Yeah. And it just shows you, I mean, a lot of people were supportive of me as a person because they've been following my journey, but also a whole load of people have found this book who just feel called to pilgrimage. As I mentioned, I feel like it is a calling. Like if you see a book called Pilgrimage, you know whether you're interested or not.
Exactly.
It really is one of those things that people either really get or they just do not understand.
Exactly.
So, I mean,
and that's what I'd like. I'd love
sorry.
you to talk about that. What are the most common reasons for pilgrimage? I know your preface describes it beautifully, but you tell us in your words again.
Yeah, well, it is in essence for me a long walk. I mean, some people cycle or horseback or whatever they do. It's a journey, but it's a journey to a spiritual place of meaning. And for many people, that is a religious journey or perhaps a spiritual journey. But also, I think in these secular times, and I'm not a Christian, I have a degree in theology. I'm very interested and I think about questions of faith, but I'm not a Christian. And so pilgrimage really is about seekers, people who are seeking an answer to a question. And for me, it was really the questions, firstly, of being, you know, a woman in midlife and the changes that occur in that time. And what is my direction? Also, I kind of reached the sort of 13 years in the job of being a writer. And it's like, well, what do I do next? Is it just book after book after book forever? Or what's the deeper meaning behind what I do? So midlife career as well. And also, it's so weird talking about the pandemic now as we record this in 2023, right? It feels so weird. You just flew in from South Africa and I'm off to New Zealand. But there was this time when we could not travel. We couldn't leave the country. We couldn't really leave our houses. I mean, we got 1 hour walk a day. It's so crazy talking about
Joanna, I was in lockdown in Cape Town. We couldn't come back to England because
exactly.
We were there for 2 years.
Which is crazy, right?
Yeah, so I understand. And from your book, how frustrated you got because you were always a world traveler, and it helped you spark your ideas. And then you found yourself constrained. And there's a quote you've got in the book: "In the moment of darkness, the call comes." So speak to that about how, that call came for you to get out of the house and walk.
Well, and that quote is by Phil Cusino in his book, The Art of Pilgrimage, which is a wonderful, wonderful book for that more spiritual side of things. But I've always felt a call to pilgrimage since my sort of teens when I was a Christian for a period. But during our COVID lockdowns and everything, I just felt like crushed. I felt like this bird in a cage with bloody wings trying to bash her way out. I needed to get out. And the only thing we could do in between the lockdowns was we could walk and be outside. And I was willing to take them. This was before the vaccine. So the fear was really high in the world. And I was afraid of going because I hadn't had COVID at that point, and we all thought we were going to die. And yet then the mental health aspect of being trapped in my house for so long, it was better for me to get out and leave than it was to stay in my house and kill my husband. So yeah, in the moment of darkness, the call comes. I mean, I was definitely going through sort of, like many people, depression and anxiety, but again, also midlife hormonal changes made that a lot worse. And we couldn't see the end of it either at that point. We really didn't know what was going to happen. And so I was like, well, if I walk, maybe I can figure this out. And I feel like people go on pilgrimage because they have this question, they have this desire for change. It's like a fork in the road, rather than just going on a long walk, which can be for exercise or whatever. So I feel like it enabled me, but I should say one pilgrimage did not fix me. And I think this is important too, because sometimes you feel like, oh, I'll just go on this journey and then I will have a moment of light and enlightenment, and suddenly I will know what to do with my life. But that isn't what happened to me. And I really don't think that's what happens to a lot of people. So it really took a couple of years and 3 pilgrimages for me to find an answer and find a way through that, by which time the pandemic was also over. So that probably helped.
Yes, but in walking the Camino, was that like the apex, really? Or was that because you'd done the other two, would you say? The
Well,
Camino was beyond the pandemic, and you walked it because it had been, is it summer longing since you were a teenager? Is that,
yeah, so
and did it finally answer the questions about your way forward?
yeah, so I have always wanted to do the Camino de Santiago. And when I was sick with COVID, so of course we all get COVID in the end, I got it and I was lying in bed. I was really sickest I've ever been. And I was like, right, I've said I will do it for 20 years. I need to do this. And basically that I made that decision. And then I did the St. Cuthbert's Way, because again, we still couldn't travel. That was 2021. We still couldn't travel. So I did the St. Cuthbert's Way. And when we talk about the kind of the apex, I actually feel like the highest point of the entire thing was crossing the sands. It was on the St. Cuthbert's Way, which was from Scotland to Lindisfarne, Melrose in Scotland to Lindisfarne. And crossing the tidal sands to Lindisfarne is one of the most memorable half an hours of my life. Walking across these, it's where the tide goes out, you can walk to the island and there are seals singing, which is just weird. And these birds, it's a bird sanctuary, and you walk over to this island that over 1,000 years ago, St. Cuthbert and the monks and everything crossed. And I really felt like a pilgrim sort of walking in the steps of history. So that was really a high point. But when I did the Camino, it was to fulfill that promise. It was much more a hopeful time. You still had to wear masks in Spain and Portugal, like in taxis and on the plane and stuff like that. But people were happy and were walking around outside with no mask on. It just felt like a new hope. And when I got home, I realized that I was happy to be home, which is something I hadn't felt like possibly ever, and that I wanted to stay here. And that was a big realization. And it might not seem like a big deal to some people, but we adopted 2 cats when I returned. And this was, we had a cat in Australia over a decade ago. And we had to, when we left, we found him a new home. And I swore I would never, ever leave an animal behind again, even though he was fine and lived another decade without us in a happy home. But again, so we have 2 cats now, and it was a commitment almost to staying in one place instead of moving on, which is something I always do. So I think coming back from the Camino, just everything fell into place. So yeah.
So I can understand that. So that was an answer in many ways. Plus, I think some of your midlife issues were also being sorted during that time.
Oh, yes. I also went on HRT, which for anyone listening, I didn't sleep properly for a couple of years. And so I was actually mentally ill from lack of sleep and those issues. And so, yes, medically, I had an answer. But also, I think even just managing to sleep helps us, comes together. But over 2.5 years, it's kind of crazy to think that. And that's why when I was writing the book, and to come back to tips for people listening, it was like a hardcore wrangling process. And I use Scrivener, which is just fantastic. And it was critical for writing this, because Scrivener, you can drag and drop things around and move things into folders and shuffling things. And I rewrote and cut and just tried to figure out this book for so long. I had so many words, so many journals, so many photos, that it was hard to figure out how it would become one book. But I'm very happy with it.
Yeah, I like the 3 parts. And talking of 3, you say there are 3 types of energy, which I related to writing a book, actually. Could you go through the 3 types of energy you need to begin and end a pilgrimage?
For sure. Well, and you're right. I use the same metaphor for writing. So the starting energy is the sort of the planning, the preparation, the idea, booking things. If you're going on a pilgrimage, booking leave, if you have it at work, and all of that kind of thing. Actually buying a plane ticket to Porto to begin my, Camino. Like, I talked about it for years and never actually done it. So that's the starting energy. And for writers, it's that idea. Maybe it's the first 20,000 words, which is always it for me. I'm like, oh, this is great, fantastic. And then I get to 20,000 words. I'm like, okay, I should probably stop and figure this out now. And then there's the pushing through energy, which is the grind, really.
Mm.
There are many days on pilgrimage. I remember one day on the Camino, had to go out it was a storm like all day. It's the tail end of a hurricane. I had blisters. I was in pain. It was chucking it down with rain. I was cold. And a lot of the walk that day was on a road, like a busy road. So it was horrible, horrible walk. And I was like, why am I doing this? And you just have to keep putting one foot after the next in order to get that day over. And sometimes you need that pushing through energy when you're writing a book. Sorry to tell people, it's like not every day of writing a book is all glorious and easy. That there are plenty of times when it's a struggle to write, in the same way as struggle to walk. And then there's the finishing energy, which is, for writers, it's finishing the editing and the publishing and then the book marketing, which we all love, obviously. And then with pilgrimage, it is, once you get to the end, it's how do you process what you have done. And for someone who doesn't want to, well, everyone here wants to write a book, but even if you don't want to write a book, it's maybe there's a photo that you want to print out or make a photo book of your journey, or maybe there's some other way that you consider sort of memorializing your trip. So, for example, on my wall here, I bought those little enamel pins. I don't think I've told anyone this. I bought these little enamel pins, 3 of them, one for each of my pilgrimages, and they're stuck on the wall. They're very small, the scallop shell and the little Pilgrim's Way and the Cuthbert's Cross. And I can just look over and I can think, I did that, and I can feel proud of it. But also I feel like it's good to remember what you achieved, because let's face it, we forget. And the pilgrimage particularly, and even writing a book, you're like, what did I do yesterday? Or what did I do 2 weeks ago? We forget the day to day. And actually, the simplicity of the Pilgrim's Day is one of the blessings. It is the same every day. And yet that is also quite easy to forget. So keeping a journal, taking photos, and then that finishing energy is really just processing it. And it might take more time than you think. Like I said, I thought I would solve my life by a 6-day pilgrimage to Canterbury, but it took a lot longer. So give yourself some grace, I think, to find the gold in your experience.
I love how you described, it's almost like post, letdown, which happens with a book and having a baby. But when you arrived at Canterbury, there was no one to say, I bless you for what you've done.
Yes, well done, pilgrim.
Tell us about, how you come to the end of it. And it's like, okay, tell us about Canterbury.
Canterbury was particularly funny because I booked accommodation. I highly recommend it. If people go to Canterbury, you can book the lodge within the cathedral grounds. And I booked the lodge. They should know, right? They should know what a pilgrimage is. And I arrive, I'm covered in mud. It rained again all that day. And I walked in, and the lady on the desk checking me in was like, oh, have you come far? And I said, oh, I've come from London. And it's a 6-day walk. It's like 180 kilometers. And she said, oh, what time did you set off this morning? And I was just like, okay, she has no clue what walking to Canterbury means. Like, in her head, it's just a train journey, it's a short train journey. But it's funny because I then understood when I arrived at Lindisfarne, and Canterbury's a big city in the UK, and many of these pilgrimage sites are big cities. And Santiago de Compostela was worse. I mean, it was so busy. It was full of people. I was like jostled around, and there's this letdown with like, oh, I've been out on my own, and now suddenly I'm in this big town and nobody cares, and they're looking at me like, what the hell are you doing, weirdo, with your backpack on? And Lindisfarne was also strange. I had this wonderful high point of walking over the sands, and then there's a bench on the other side, and I sat down, and because I wore shoes walking over, you can do it bare feet better, so I took off my wet shoes, and then I walked around the corner, and there's a coach park with all these day trippers, and I was like, what, this is just crazy. So yeah, the sort of the letdown of arriving on a pilgrimage when you think it will be this spiritual moment and or some kind of fanfare, like that just doesn't happen. So what I suggest to people is make sure you book accommodation in the place you're going to for a couple of days, or at least a day afterwards. Don't just get on a plane or get on a bus the next day, because you need time to like settle down a bit and experience. So Canterbury Cathedral, I went to Evensong that night, which was also amazing, very memorable.
I love how you described that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was just, and I was one of the first there, and the sound in the cathedrals, that was a spiritual moment. But then I went back the next day as a tourist. I bought the ticket and did the tourist tour and, had breakfast and all those things just to settle in before coming home. It was like that separation between the two. But yeah, I think, and also with a book, talking about expectations, some of the most disappointed authors are those who think that their book is for everyone and it's going to change everyone's life and it might make them a million and they can retire. And the expectations around a book launch are, I don't know where they come from, because I don't know hardly anyone to whom it happens. I mean, the media reports on the super successes, but most of our books enter the world and nobody really cares. So then we have to be the ones to champion our books. And the reward is how you've been changed along the way. And some people will love it and resonate, but many people won't. And we can't be upset about that. We just have to give it to the world in the best way. And the world some people will find it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that analogy that we've made between the pilgrimage and writing a book. Another question. Are you planning to do yet another pilgrimage one day?
Well, I would say I'm addicted to traveling, so I do like to travel. But because my husband's super supportive, for me to go off on my own doing these walks, but I have walked a lot on my own for the last 3 years. So I plan to do more with him for now. But I do have one in mind that I would love to do, which it's a Japanese one in Japan. It's called the Shikoku pilgrimage, and it's like 750 miles, like 1,000 kilometers, around 88 temples. And I've always had a book I want to do in Japan about these ancient monks that mummify themselves by eating this particular sap that makes them essentially turn into mummies. It's amazing. It's one of my arcane thriller ideas, which are all quite weird and have religious angles. But so that pilgrimage might be a really interesting way to get sort of into the Japanese culture. So part of me wants to do more, but I do have another reflection for people, which if you are going to do a pilgrimage, so one of my rules, and you set rules for yourself, was to carry my own pack and walk every step of the way. But I certainly had quite a lot of pain and blisters at different points. So my rule now is hire baggage transfer.
Really? It doesn't undermine your experience of the pilgrimage. If you
would have done with those three, because I had this rule, but now I feel like I've done that. I've done the long walks for weeks on end with a pack. And I think especially if people have never walked long distance before or multi-days, then having your pack carried just means you have a lighter time of it and you'll be in less pain, which, let's face it, makes your journey more enjoyable. I was probably punishing myself in some way by doing that. But
you were atoning for a sin. That's one of the things you say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why else walk pilgrimage? But no, I feel like I've atoned now, and next time I will get baggage transfer.
Well, that's good to hear. And I think it really, your book will inspire people because, Jan, I want to just let people know it's so practical as well. We've talked about the mindset and the energy, but actually, I think is it part 2 or 3? Is it part 3? You really give really valuable tips. So when I first put it to you before we jumped on, why another book on pilgrimage? I think the answer is partly because this is a current times, and now you can give current information. And one of the things that I didn't ask, and I'd like to before we end, is what time of year did you travel to avoid the crowds later in the year, or is that to avoid the heat?
Yeah, so, well, the first one, the Pilgrim's Way, was because we were in between lockdowns.
Okay, so that was, okay.
Yeah, that was why. And then it had the added benefit of being autumn, so it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold. And then the following year, again, I did the Cuthbert's similar time because I'd had COVID in the July.
So it was...
I had to recover, and I was still really weak, super weak.
I think that was amazing you did that after being ill.
I was trying to prove something, I was trying to prove that I could survive and all of that type of thing.
Yeah.
And then the Camino, I originally booked for the April, but I moved it to the September that year because I just wasn't ready. And then, but you say to avoid the busy times, the Camino of whichever route you choose, it is a busy busy pilgrimage. Like if you want a solo pilgrimage, it's more wildernessy, the St. Cuthbert's is amazing, and I highly recommend that. The Camino is an industry. I put it in the book. You have to embrace the industry that is the Camino, and just like, okay, this is what it is. I'm going to do this, and it's particularly busy in the last sort of 4 or 5 days, as everyone jumps on that last 100 kilometers to get the Compostela certificate, which you have to do 100 kilometers to get. But yes, it's I would say the Camino is not really a solo thing. Like, there are loads of people there, and the quiet times of the year are when a lot of the things are closed. So the accommodation might be closed, that kind of thing, if you want to go in deep midwinter. But yeah, so definitely research the time of year.
But it's in your book as well, who to contact. And I think that's what's wonderful about you. You know, you have there are moments of, what you say, the spiritual veil thins, and you know, one of them was in this one. And yet there's a lot of practical information that people might want to know. And rather than them emailing you,
yes, I put it all in there.
It's all in there. Well, thank you, Joanna. I don't want to take more of your time, but it's been really great. There may be people listening who really feel that they've reached the crossroads or want an answer to something. And the fact that they can start smaller in England could be, you know, a lot of encouragement.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, Carol. This has been really fun.
So, Joanna, tell us, where can people find Pilgrimage?
Yeah, so Pilgrimage is out everywhere on all your favorite stores in all your favorite formats, or audiobook, ebook, paperback, and the special edition hardback is available, and the workbook, I should say, there's a workbook too, is on my bookstore, creativepennbooks.com. And also, if people are interested, I have a books and travel podcast available on your favorite podcast app. So hopefully people will find that useful.
Because you've got some episodes on your podcast as well, don't you?
Yeah, lots on pilgrimage, absolutely. And there are pictures on my Instagram at JF Penn over the years as well, if people are interested.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. Thank you, Joanna.
Thanks so much for having me, Carol.
Sponsoring the show today is Carol Westmore's best-selling book, The Inner Path of Writing. Make love, not war to the writer within. Foreword by Dr. Joe Vitale. This book is collated by Carol Westmore, who interviewed 20 world-class experts in the fields of publishing, authorship, and transformation. They share how to break through your inner blocks and access your genius as a writer or creative. People are saying it's like chicken soup for the writer's soul. Buy this treasure trove of wisdom and get the accompanying bonuses valued at $500 at www.ipwbook.com.
Thanks for joining me on today's podcast. Want a free gift to inspire you further on your book writing adventure? My free checklist, 5 book hook tips to kickstart your book writing journey, will help you get clarity on the key essentials to make your book a winner. Download it at writethebookinsideyou.com/free gift. The links are in the show notes. Until next time, a big virtual hug and keep writing.